everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm just moving a few things. There we go. So I'm Denise Raine, as Steve said, one of the directors of security, focusing mainly on the satisfaction survey side of the business. What I've done today is put together a relatively short, hopefully, presentation around customer satisfaction surveys. This was originally meant to be presented at our SPBM conference in London in April, but obviously things have changed and I've updated the presentation to reflect that. Acuity has clients which range in size from 68 units to well over 40,000. So I really enjoy working with a wide range. For those of you, the larger clients that are wondering what on earth is SPBM, just to remind you, HouseMark does work in partnership. Acuity works in partnership with HouseMark, delivering benchmarking services to those with less than 1,000 units. I've split the session up into 3 sections. The first 2 are the largest, one just bringing you up to date on the HouseMark framework and where the review's taken us, and then look at the changing times from last year and this year. Some interesting things coming out. So just coming out, and I'll take some breaks after that, and I'll just very quickly finish off with a look to the future and some good practice tips. So without further ado, let's get started. So if hopefully you're all aware, last year HouseMark carried out a very large review on the STAR framework. It was run through HouseMark and Acuity, and TLF took part and managed the project. There was lots of reasons for the review. We needed to focus, a renewed focus on consumer standards, the growth in digital communication, innovation coming in from other sectors, surveys asking the commercial sector were coming in. There's also an appetite for real-time feedback and the desire to use the latest analytical tools. That was one of the drivers. And I think we'd all admit, HouseMark would say that the numbers submitting data are beginning to fall. And it was just literally felt, it was really good time to have a refresh in the sector. We had hoped that we would know more from the regulator in terms of what they were looking for, but at the moment we're still not sure. So anyway, we carried out the review. It was the largest review ever undertaken in this area. It took up most of the year. A huge amount of consultation involved, 13,000 tenants in total, 300 organisations. This involved online surveys with practitioners, residents, discussion groups. We had panels run by TPAS. And at the end of all that, we didn't actually get any consensus. So then we had another online survey and asked everybody what they thought. Important to stress that throughout the review, the government and the regulator were kept informed of what we were doing, and they had input, and the themes from the green paper were obviously brought in and looked at. So at the end of 2019, we had a new framework. And these are some slides from HouseMark, so apologies if you've seen them before, but these sum up the outputs quite nicely. So in terms of what came out, just to clear up, obviously we're talking about perception and transactional surveys now. So a perception survey is a random survey of residents asking for their views, whereas a transactional survey will follow an interaction. So that will follow something like repairs or a letting or ASB complaint, something like that. So just to clear that one up at the beginning. So what have we got? There are now 5 core questions in the STAR framework. There were 7 before. Some see that as an improvement. We were really keen to get the number down, and I'll come back to those in a minute. There's 4 in the perception and actually 1 in a transactional survey. We still have the core library, which is that reference guide with a spreadsheet with all the different questions in there. That's been updated, and that resource is still available. One of the other changes of the review came around the flexibility now to collect data that you can submit to HouseMark or SPBM, and the variety of methods, postal, telephone, always around. Online now can be used on its own, and that's to recognise the flexibility of approaches that landlords are collecting data by. The other key change was more of a minor one, but we've kept the 5 to 10 scale, which includes an either in the middle. As always with any review, these are challenged, but no improvement could be found. We looked at the impact on 10-point There is a slight one, but again, it is comparable with the 5 points that was kept. We've also introduced the ability to have stars and emojis, recognising the growth in digital communications and surveys, so they're now acceptable. And there's going to be a new star rating, which I'll come on to in a minute, but that's going to be launched now later on in the year. And also, although I talk mainly about perception surveys, we do have the transactional surveys in the framework. There are questions around for repairs, ASB complaints and lettings, and the questions have followed through into there. So I just want to touch with the core questions just to bring those up to date. So of the 5 perception core questions, 4 of them sit in a perception survey. And as you're probably all aware, 2 of the questions have remained, which is satisfaction with the service provided and the quality of the home. If you're involved in the review, please don't think for a minute that these questions weren't challenged. They were punched and everything, talk to residents and find out what they think about when they answer those sort of questions. And we know there was no other question that came across that would give a better response or a greater understanding than these 2 questions, so they have remained. We've also seen the introduction of 2 new questions. The first one, thinking about the building you live in, how satisfied are you that your home is safe and secure? This was very much a fall from Grenfell, the importance of a landlord ensuring that the home and the property in the building is safe. So that one's been introduced. And the other question, the final one, was, is your landlord easy to deal with? And there was a lot of challenge on that one. It was brought in to replace the listen and ask question. It's a good question in terms of understanding. It was very popular with tenants as well. It's nice to have a simple short question in the survey. So that one's come in, and I'll have a look at these in a minute. And then the last one, the 5th one, is satisfaction with repairs service, but this has moved from a perception survey to a transactional survey. And the idea behind this is that the perception survey, we all know the scores are much lower, can be up to 10-15% lower than the results that a landlord will be seeing in a responsive repairs survey. And it was felt actually that question reflected better the service that's in place. So that's why that one's been introduced. So those are the 5 questions. What I want to do is just look at the 2 new ones. So thinking about whether your home is safe and secure. Now, at Security, we've been asking these questions for the last year. And what I'm showing here is just the results from 5 landlords that went out with a new question early on in the year. So 4,500 responses in there in an average. And just to give you a flavour, it was general needs and sheltered, telephone and postal, and a range of diverse landlords in there. What this question is showing for me, obviously it's not scientific because there's just 5 results in there, but it does look like the sort of median score is around the mid-80s. A high score will be in the 90s on this question, and anything seen from other surveys below 80 does look slightly low. The thing I like particularly about this question is the number of neithers is small, which means that residents have an opinion. They're voting one way or the other, which is a good test of a question. And what that translates to, for example, if you look at landlord 4, 18% of their tenants said that they're not satisfied that their home is safe and secure. And for that landlord in particular, and that's 330 residents, it's a significant number to go back at. And I think the real value for this question is having the follow-up one, which is if it's not safe and secure, why is that? And I'm just showing, it's a very long chart there. If you ask this sort of open-ended probe on that question, you don't quite get the questions back that the regulator and the government were trying to focus in on in terms of health and safety and fire issues. You get the whole range of why a resident thinks their home's not secure. Some of the issues around door and window security, but again, we're coming into crime and antisocial behaviour issues. And I've just shown the whole range of questions at the top level theme. Obviously they can be grouped, but I think it's sometimes useful just to see the diverse range that can come out when you begin to ask residents to explain why they've given the score that they did. So I think this is a really good question. Equally, the other new one, which is your landlord easy to deal with? Straightforward. I went back again, the same 5 landlords, and looked at their scores. This is the result shown from a perception survey, the general one, but obviously it is being used in transactionals as well. It is, in fact, it stems from the revamped customer effort question, which is very much used in the commercial sector. As a business, are we easy to deal with? Do we keep our customers and purchases? That's where it stems from. But we've translated it here. And tenants that we asked really liked it. They really understood what it was about. And it was meant to, as I say, replace the listens to views and acts. So again, from these surveys, we can see that, and I've seen this in other surveys, an 85% response rate is looking like a good score. Questions may be raised when that begins to perhaps drop below 80%. And once again, one of the strengths of this question is that we don't get too many residents answering in the middle. Again, residents have a view on this, which is very important. Whereas if you remember back to the listen and views question, you often got something like 25% of tenants answering neither, just sitting in the middle because they've not had a conversation or engaged with their landlord. So I think there's power in this question. And again, you can follow up, why aren't we easy to deal with? The reason this question is so good, I'm just going to attempt to show you. If you've seen any of my presentations before, it's key driver analysis. So what I did for, actually this is taken from 10 landlords, 5,000 telephone interviews we've done in the last month. And what I've plotted here is the relationship between overall satisfaction with the landlord and how they answered some of the key or recommended questions. And so we're looking at individual responses and the patterns behind that. And what the chart's telling you is that the vertical height gives you the satisfaction rating over those landlords. And the more a score comes to the right, it means it's got a greater influence on overall satisfaction. Now, if you've been running this regression on your own data for a number of years, you will know that often it's repairs and maintenance or listens to views that comes as a far right outlier, occasionally quality of home if the score's not high. And as you can see from this chart alone, and we're seeing it at individual landlord, that ease of being easy to deal with has got a much more influence on overall satisfaction. So it's that power of communications and engagement strategy. So for me, it backs up and reinforces why that question has taken over as a core question from that. So just a bit more in depth there. I'll just keep going for a little while and I'll pick up some questions on the review. Okay, so the other thing that came out from the review was, as we all know, landlords are changing the way they've done surveys. It's certainly been changing from the old days when they were postal. And what we know, this was from last year, 45% of landlords are now taking a multi-channel approach. It's growth in digital surveys. Landlords are very supportive of this, and the residents themselves said, actually, we prefer to respond in the way that suits us. So again, a multitude of preferences it does seem to be the way to go. But I just sort of, again, I would throw some caution to the wind on the approaches. We know that age has got an impact on satisfaction, and we also know that landlords in London particularly suffer from a 10% lower rating. What we've done, and this was some of the work we did from the HouseMark Data Summit in October, was we looked at the results from 25,000 individual surveys by survey method. And as you can see clearly in that chart, satisfaction scores always come up higher from a postal survey. As we all know, it's a postal over response, no matter how the data is weighted, is that over bias from older residents responding. They're usually satisfied. But it does show that telephone and online surveys are lower. And for some landlords in particular, the online survey results can be much lower for all age groups. Even older residents responding online can have a sort of rating that's 10 to 25% lower than an older resident responding by telephone or a postal. So my advice in moving down the digital approach, if you're not, some of you will already be there, is to tread carefully and test, see if you've got that bias. It's quite important. Otherwise you may find yourself in front of a board explaining why satisfaction's dipped by 10%, and actually it hasn't, it's just a change in survey method. And then the last thing from the STAR a review was the introduction of a new star rating. It's a visual guide. It was very well supported. 86% of landlords really like this idea to move away from these league tables and to get some sort of rating. Residents liked it as well. It was very easy to understand. The science behind this still has to be worked out, and the idea is that if you're in a city or younger residents, that will be taken into account in your scoring. The idea is that HouseMark will show how the ratings are awarded, so we can understand the rationale behind them. And from a personal point of view, I like it because obviously when I think quartiles have got a place, but somebody with quartiles by their very nature, someone always has to be in the bottom 25%, and that may not be the case if the range of results are tight. It's unfair. So hopefully you haven't all switched off. That's just literally a quick overview of the STAR review and where we're at now. So I'm going to just check in with Steve and see if we've got any questions around the STAR review.
Yes, we have, and I'd encourage you all to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to post any questions for Denise. We've got a couple so far, Denise.
Yeah.
Leslie says, I can't help but feel that the questions have been generalized to such a degree that you start to lose insight. So, for example, how easy is your landlord to deal with? It could relate to ease of making contact, poor response. It could be a whole bunch of different things. And then you need to ask them a secondary question to explain their rating. His point is, aren't we just asking them more questions?
I think it's a good point. I think it is definitely a high level indicator. And in order to understand how a landlord or a resident has achieved that rating, you need to, as I agree, is unpick underneath that, because from the percentage alone, you won't be able to do much. So I totally agree that if necessary, you need to ask supplementary questions.
Okay, dokes, thanks. And actually, Francis Bolton has asked a question that was at the back of my mind, so I might tag something on myself, just to put you on the spot. So he's saying, why do you think the same age groups give lower scores online compared to postal?
Okay, lots of research on this, not just from our sector. Traditionally, it's that notion of the eco warrior online and hammering out on the keyboard your rant, and so that may be partly the reason behind it. I think we've got a lot more work to do to understand this, but it does appear, it is definitely there for some landlords, and other landlords it isn't. We've got a client in the southwest who gets a huge response online and has no difference between the two. So I think there are different factors sometimes at play as well. It's not an easy one.
Okay, so if I can just tag mine onto it. So if we know that there are these, you get different results from different channels, is there any fancy maths that we can apply to it to level the playing field?
We've tried with numerous data sets to do that, but what you're doing is you're then overlaying data with data assumptions to produce the results, which are then become open to challenge in those assumptions. So there is no easy formula, but I think there needs to be work on it, but it's not easy. And we've had a go with some data sets to some success, but without knowing the numbers and the formula, it's really difficult.
And Jonathan Card saying, is it still recommended to carry out a STAR survey every 3 years? And how does that sit with the demand for real-time data?
I'll pick up that later on if that's okay.
Okie dokes. And Polly Cox just come in. I haven't read this one yet, so I hope there's no swear words in it. Do you think that organisations have been doing online surveys for longer get better results using online?
Interesting. I don't know. Online's not been around for that long for that many landlords, but it's definitely something to look at. And I think the success of online depends on how a landlord communicates with their residents. If that's a common approach and communication channel for a large percentage, then I think, and that's developed over time, I think your response and satisfaction levels will vary from a newer landlord that doesn't use that as a communication channel. Not easy.
Okay, so we'll come back to Jonathan's in due course. I'll just keep it live. So I think if we've got no further questions, I think we can crack on.
Okay, so now I'm going into a history lesson. It's like being back at school. Okay, so while we were doing the review last year seems such a long way away now. While we were doing the review, we began to notice that some of our clients, and our clients, we have fantastic clients, and normally results stay the same or go up, but we were beginning to see clients where ratings weren't where we felt they should be, or they just stayed. So I began to have a nosy around. Now, just to give you the bit of history, the great thing about STAR, love it or hate it, is that there is a lot of national data around, and it goes back nearly 20 years. In fact, I've got data back to 98 on this, shows how long I've been involved. And what we've seen over that period, going back from status to STAR, is that as a sector, satisfaction's constantly been going up. I mean, it can't go up forever. It would be impossible. And the rating, as you notice, it's not there for 2019. I'm still waiting on HouseMark, that figure. But it's around 85, 87%. And what we saw last year, it took a little while for this to click, but we began to notice that these landlords weren't quite achieving what we were expected. So I dug out data, went back to the last 26 landlords, this is about autumn, and had a look. And what I found, as you can see on that chart, was that very few landlords unusually were seeing increased satisfaction. Maybe they'd optimised satisfaction levels, but landlords were also, some of them, seeing lower. And this is comparing the result from 2019 with a survey run in previous years and trackers that were combined figures brought in. So we began to look at this and talked to quite a few people about why or whether they felt this was happening. I spoke to HouseMark. HouseMark had also thought they'd seen this, a levelling off at the best, but of course it's not something that we want to get out into the press. So we began to theorise, and what we thought about was, is there a decline in service offer? Well, we didn't think amongst our clients that happened. Has the resident population changed? Is lettings coming, younger residents are coming in? Yes, but that's always been the case. Have residents suddenly got higher expectations? We don't think so. Difficult operating environment, it's always difficult. So when you take out all the housing factors, all that can be left is something not related to housing. And everyone we spoke to, we thought, actually, if you can remember back to last year, the mood of the nation, not just tenants, was actually quite below average. And we think things like Brexit, the general election, climate crisis, cuts to local authority services are still going on, and trusting issues around Grenfell fires, there was lots in the press. And actually, we think that had a huge influence on resident satisfaction with their landlord last year. And I was beginning to think, I'm not sure how this is going to pan out in 2020. Little did I know. So that was where we were at coming into the year. And then we got the pandemic. Obviously, we were watching this quite closely. We've got live interviews out in the field 6 days a week. And we began from mid-March to ask our interviewers to know any mention of COVID-19 or coronavirus, anecdotally and away from the structured questions. And pre-lockdown, most residents were happy to take the calls. That continued, and the response rates, I was concerned that people were going to stop wanting to talk to surveys given the encroaching crisis, but people were happy. They were okay to talk to us. Response rates stayed the same, and the interviewers reporting that residents seemed friendlier than normal, which was joyful. And then lockdown hit. The chart just shows some comments that we were picking up about what tenants were thinking pre-lockdown, so some interesting things. But when lockdown hit, as we all know, the majority of landlords that we were working with carried on with the telephone surveys, obviously with interruption on responsive repairs. But landlords began to make their own calls to check on residents and vulnerable, and we adapted our surveys as well. So some changes which I'm about to share with you for free landlords. But the other thing we began to see was evidence of higher satisfaction ratings. So I'm just going to share with you the experience of three of our clients. So The first client introduced a question on, this was a STAR tracker, and they just wanted to be helpful. So appreciate it's a difficult time during lockdown. Is there anything that we could do to help? And it was a very open question, so we coded the responses. We got some fantastic comments about how staff have been out in the field and checking on residents, and I'm sure that's true of all the people here today. But nevertheless, we identified a small number who had an issue and needed to be recontacted around support or financial concerns. So it was just a small change to a survey that was out there in the field anyway, but it showed where the concerns of that resident population were, and how they were coping. So it was an interesting introduction early on. So just some things to think about there. I'm sure you've all asked these. Just want to show you another landlord. Second landlord, they wanted to know, are we handling the pandemic how you would like? So are we good? How good are we at responding to the pandemic? And this was scored on a 1 to 10 scale, and roughly 60%, so 6 out of 10 residents felt that the landlord had responded very well to the pandemic. And we got them to explain what they could have done better. And as you can see in the table on the right, the positive comments were all around good communication and being happy with the landlord response. I ran a phrase count on there to see, and we were getting very impressed, pleased, we've appreciated. So a huge amount of gratitude and positivity towards the landlord. At the bottom, at the other end of the scale, they're always there. So 20% roughly were not satisfied. And the reason around that was that they had said that they hadn't been communicated, and that was mentioned by about 2/3 of the residents. So the key has been communication, but also the same communication has been well received by some residents and not by others. So an interesting set just from a very short couple of questions. And the final thing just to share with you was a third landlord who actually introduced a COVID survey, and we ran that for them. Quite a number of questions in the survey. The first two were asked, how satisfied are you with the landlord's response, and did the landlord have your best interest at heart and listen to you? What I find really interesting in this and some of the other surveys is we have a real 60 satisfied and 20% dissatisfied, as you saw in the earlier, the landlord before, and it does seem to feel like that. I've seen that in other surveys. But encouragingly, the landlord went on and asked, during lockdown, could you get in contact with us? And I take heart 86%, which is high, said it was easy, and 6% difficult. So some encouraging news that despite changing the services and the way the landlord delivered those, that resident could still get through. Then they said, is there anything else you could have done differently to the response? And that's the chart at the top at the right. And as we've probably gathered from the, it's all around communications. I'm sure you're aware as well, in terms of communication that's been going out, certainly around the benchmarking groups, huge amounts of wealth of information and back out to residents as well. So 28% said actually you could have improved your communication. The really interesting question for me, and we're having a debate about this internally, is that the last question asked, thinking about how you deal with your landlord, is there anything you would do differently once the pandemic is over? 10% said yes. I think this was based on 500 residents, so it was 50 residents. And when we asked them to say, what would you have done, what would you be doing differently? Obviously, it's not scientific, it's a small cohort of residents, but the thing that I took from this is that looking at the language that was used, 18 residents said that they were going to be more demanding, as I've called them. They're going to chase more, complain more, stand their ground more, stop being patient with them, and speak my mind. Now, having talked to some colleagues as well, you could take that actually they were always like that and they're not going to, but the use of the word more. So I do think there's a change there, and I do think around that residents are going to perhaps change the way that they deal with their landlords and expect more. As you'd also expect, some of the other things coming out were around online, digital, more use of the website, which obviously is great news. But some people have obviously used the phone more and found that things happened if you use the phone. So again, it'll be communication and channels shifting. interesting things coming on from that. So a small number, but nevertheless quite interesting. So that was our findings from free landlords. Jonathan Cox at HouseMark kindly told me what he'd been experiencing as well. And what they've seen as a pandemic is pausing of surveys as you'd expect, but also some landlords have continued and they recognise that these surveys do deliver invaluable feedback, as we were finding, and it is a mechanism to find more information on your vulnerable tenants. So again, that echoes our view. Again, they have seen improved satisfaction in times of crisis, with an 8% increase on average. And the reason for this is theorising that we know that satisfaction does increase with public services when there's a crisis. And we also know that without repairs being carried out, although that may be a cause of frustration, we know that residents that have had a responsive repair recently quite often can be quite dissatisfied. So that's been taken out of the equation for a little while. And all the effort that landlords have done in terms of contacting vulnerable tenants and offering support is clearly being recognised. So we'd already looked at this and just showing what we found at Acuity. So I went to some of our tracking clients and pulled out the results from 10 landlords, 9 housing associations and local authority, just to look at how their satisfaction was sitting for a survey carrying out during lockdown and the scores before. And as you can see, for most landlords, they've either seen a slight increase or a significant increase in resident satisfaction. And we've just had one unlucky landlord where that hasn't been the case. But nevertheless, it does confirm what HouseMark have been seeing as well around increased satisfaction during this time. So that's what we've seen on COVID. I'd be really interested to know your opinions on what we've just seen and what you're all doing. Any questions, Steve?
Right, yes, again, I'd encourage people to use the Q&A function to put their questions to us. We've got Mark Allen at Chisel, who's just going back to the first part of the presentation and just picking up the issue on being able to use different channels, giving you different results. So what he's basically saying is, if you're getting such different results, you know, why should we actually trust the methodology?
Okay, so the methodology, I mean, what, for example, HouseMark do on a larger scale is that when you're looking to benchmark your results and compare with other landlords, you can put in just to compare with landlords that have used the same methodology as you. So you can look at like for like, so postal against postal, telephone against telephone, and online the same. I think that should give you some confidence. I don't think that in the next 3 to 5 years that we're going to see any solution around, you know, there is a logic to putting the survey method in the way, into the format that residents will respond back and that they prefer to use. And the difficulty, I agree, is totally how do we take those results when we've got different methodologies. But as long as you're comparing like for like or similar, most landlords though will, if you're running a telephone or a postal survey, most of our clients will run an online survey at the same time, but the numbers at the moment aren't huge. So it may only be 5 or 10% of the responses, and then we can see what the difference looks like. So I think there's some lessons that are going to be learnt. HouseMark had hoped to publish guidance on this in their guides, but we hadn't found anything at the moment that we wanted to share. So again, it's work in progress on that one.
So is it possible for the actual results, I mean, is it possible for clients to actually benchmark just against other organisations that have used the same channel as them to have their results presented in that format?
Yeah.
So that would equalise things. And I guess the other point is we also know from the last 20 years or so, that we've, or 15 years, we've spotted that there are certain trends. Like we know that older people are generally happier than younger people. So again, I think there's almost a similar issue there, in that if you've got high numbers of HFOP, the chances are and if you were comparing in a very general sense to general providers, your results are going to look quite good on average. So again, I guess what we're saying is if you really want meaningful comparisons, you need to be comparing like with like, and probably comparing against other organisations that have similar percentages of HFOP.
Definitely. And that's one of the things that the star rating's hoping to do, is to take in some sort of weighting for that reflects the age of the population that's responded. And that's why when with HouseMark, for example, when you submit your data, you have to say what percentage of the respondents were in different age groups. So that is available at that level, yeah.
Right.
And then SPBM, you can compare general needs housing for older people, or I do agree when you compile it up to landlord level, it certainly has an input.
And I think it's probably worth me just mentioning at this point that I think I'm right in thinking that London-based tenants are generally less satisfied than elsewhere in the country. So there's probably an argument for those with a heavy London southeast bias in terms of their properties, or they're just exclusively based down there. It's probably in their interest to be comparing to other Londoners. Yeah,
absolutely. And again, that's something that we're taking into account with the star rating.
Right, excellent. Okay, thank you for that. Right, we've got, I think in a similar vein, we've got Leslie has just come in and said, I'm going to have to read this one. I may have misunderstood this, but are we saying that the same people will give a lower score for an online survey, or whether different age groups give a lower online score?
Difficult question, thanks, Leslie. In any one survey, measures are in place to stop the same resident responding. So if you've got two channels open, postal and online, the same resident can't submit a response both ways. So it's very difficult to compare individual responses. But yes, in theory, you think about your own personal circumstances. How do you moan and complain? You know, is it something that you're happy to pop online and through TripAdvisor, you know, put a comment in? Is it, or do you go, how more often do you go back with a negative than a positive? There's lots of influencing factors on that.
Right, okay. And yeah, I'm sorry, I may have set some hairs running on the London thing. Rolf Mueller has just written a question, which is that London specific, or is that something that applies to any city?
It's London, because we've looked over the years, we've looked in Birmingham, Manchester, Liverpool, you know, cities up and down the country, and it's such a greater difference in London. And it doesn't necessarily, there's an urban rural issue as well, but there is a London factor as well. It's unique.
And have you got a hypothesis on that at all?
Not one I'd want to share.
Right, okay.
You can come up with multiple hypotheses on that one, but it's been around there for 15 years in the data, so it's not a new factor.
Okay. Okay, well, thanks for that. We're just checking the time. There's Jonathan's question, which is still outstanding. Are you still going to come to that a bit later on? Okay, yep. All right. Well, I think we should press ahead.
Okay, so just a couple of slides left really, but quite a few things to think about. So I've just put it all on one slide. So looking to the future, what's happening? And where are we going next? So I just really want to point out that STAR is voluntary. It's a best practice framework. You don't have to use it. You don't even have to do surveys. Most landlords do, and I think that stands a lot for how robust it is and the value for doing that. So landlords are beginning to submit satisfaction data based on the new framework. HouseMark at the moment, for example, have got 53 data sets with the new questions, and a further 200 are expected this year. So it seems to be business as usual, and hopefully the new frameworks are helping to that. The new guides, which explain how to carry out perception and transactional surveys, which I've helped write, they will now be out in mid-July, and they will be including more on digital survey methods, so watch out for those. And the star ratings, which are eagerly awaited, have been pushed back into the autumn, and they are going to take account, as we're just talking about landlords' context, to provide a genuine comparative data set, which hopefully will be easy to understand. So that's still work to be done. We're all waiting for the white paper, and when we see consumer standards satisfaction metrics coming out from the HouseMark perspective and the STAR framework, it will be adjusted to take that into account. And we're just waiting to see on that one. And just really for those of you that are sort of, if you've picked up on something that the original review did want to bring in the latest analytical tools. So that seems like sentiment analysis, predictive analysis. And I was really excited because I thought everyone's going to get together and explain how these are just doing brilliant, bringing up brilliant results and how they're working in the sector. The reality was that came out from the review is that only the very largest landlord actually is beginning to look at predictive analysis, and that's on repairs data. Sentiment analysis is around and it's working to some extent in different levels, but it's not really there. So I'm calling that work in progress, and I do hope to see more in the next few years. So that's where we are with the framework. And then in terms of satisfaction surveys, there is increasing use of digital surveys. It's certainly been, and that was what we knew at the beginning of the year, it's definitely been amplified by the pandemic. And this is something to think about. There are huge advantages of going digital. I'm putting in there that also we've seen increased use of telephone interviews from some possibly smaller landlords. It's gaining traction from over postal surveys, and that's the ability to bring in additional insight. People do want, as Jonathan alluded to, more regular feedback. People don't want to wait 3 years to find out how they're doing. So we are seeing more regular surveys. Real-time feedback was the name of the review, and that certainly is the case on transactional surveys, where you've got live feedback straight into the service area from when the call ends with the resident. So we are there to some extent on transactional surveys. They do need to be balanced with cost of regular surveys and survey fatigue, particularly among smaller landlords. It can be a challenge. In terms of emerging themes, what's coming out? I mean, obviously, COVID's impact businesses dramatically. So there is definitely going to be more use of these surveys in capturing intelligence from residents, identifying vulnerable residents. From HouseMark, the work that they've done on their impact monitoring exercise, we know that 28% of residents that were identified, so for them it's 1.4 million, were vulnerable due to COVID and lockdowns, a huge number of our residents, and 14% were identified as being financially vulnerable due to insecurity. So again, you know, those are going to go out, and that's not going to go away overnight. We're going to see increased issues around that in the sector. As landlords have rapidly changed the way they deliver their services in the last few months, you know, we're going to be looking at how that continues and having engagement with residents to collect their feedback on how to shape services going forward in the way that residents want and the way that fits with the new normal. And I also think another issue that will come from that, because, you know, as a social landlord we have a purpose, is organisational values, and this is something I've looked at for a long time. So if you're sort of like, if you say your reason is to provide quality homes that are affordable in happy or great places to live, do you ask your residents if they think you do? We see that in some surveys. If you say, for example, you put residents at the heart of everything you do, has anybody asked their residents if they feel that's the case? So I do think there's those questions need to come in as well. And I've just thrown on the end of that the green agenda. It's not going to go away. Obviously, it has taken a second seat to work with the pandemic, but the houses that we built can, even in the press today, there was this week was saying that temperatures in the UK, for example, are going over 40 degrees. That could become, how does that impact our homes up to that standard? I've seen questions and inquiries from our clients around, people asking about carbon neutral or energy efficient. So I think that will come back. So lots of change and lots of interesting things going on with the surveys. And my final slide is, because I always get asked when I do this, is have you got any tips if you're running a survey at the moment or thinking about it? So here goes. And so field work. So census or sample, that depends on what you're doing at that point in time. You need to understand the margin of error and how reliable you need that data. If you're just looking at results to give you some trend analysis, it doesn't need to be as reliable as data that you're reshaping your business on. So you really need to think hard about that. And survey methodology. There is a role for postal surveys. It's a right for some resident groups for sure. And if you don't go out all the time, it does give everybody the ability to respond. But the caveat on that is we know response rates are falling and have been falling for a long time. Telephone surveys, I really like them. They're targeted, they're precise, you can probe, you know, why don't you feel your home is safe and secure? They do need to be shorter, you know, 45 questions on the phone, you lose the will to live at the end of it. So there is a role, but they need to be a different beast in some ways to a postal. And then online, it's going to be the growth, because they're so cost effective, fast, you know, the data comes back immediately. But again, have you got the email or mobile numbers if you're doing a link to an online survey? And my advice would be to pilot first if you're not already there, in which case we'd love to hear from you because we're trying to look at the impact of that. So that's the field work. Survey questions that we've just talked a little bit about, but always ask what you, staff, management, stakeholders and residents want to know at that point in time. That's what it's about. It's, you should spend the most time developing your question sets and get help if you need it. Ask around. Everyone's always got questions that they've asked similar before that work, so they're the ones to go for. There's going to be a lot more about redesigning services and identifying vulnerable residents in there. The other things just to point out, just because HouseMark has dropped the need to ask that really general satisfaction question around the repairs and maintenance survey doesn't mean you shouldn't include it in a perception survey. You know, back to that key driver analysis chart, that relied on being able to plot that data. Yes, you can plot it for the last repair, but I would still keep it in if you can fit it in. And also the move to demoting the listen and ask view means that in the top core questions there is not really a resident involvement question. I think that, you know, there's a role there to have one in. Greater use for open-ended questions and probing, that's where you're going to get actionable insight. Percentages are great for KPIs and trends, but they won't tell you what you need to do. My thing that I always go on about is customer recovery. Get the 2 permission questions in at the end so you can go back and ask residents about what they've said and try and have resources in-house to deal with anything that's been raised in the survey, so it shows that you listen and you do take action. And then other considerations, timing. You can survey now. Lots of people do. I think it's going to get very busy in the autumn, and there's lots of great reasons to do so. But you do need quality and consistent approach. So think about the other surveys you're running at the same time and make sure they're all aligned. Internal, external, that's a question for you. I think it depends on resources and what you perceive in terms of value for money on that. Frequency, there's no right way. This is perception and transaction. We run weekly, monthly, quarterly, 6 monthly, annually, every 2 years, every 3 years, every 5 years, and some sure never. It's what's right for you as an organisation. I did a board presentation 2 days ago, and they were like, the board is, you know, we don't want to wait 3 years for the next data set to know how we've done. How do you address that when you've got only 300-400 residents? So it's a challenge, particularly for smaller landlords. And also the larger landlords are definitely carrying out, we've seen a huge move to tracking surveys. So that's where you don't carry out a one-off perception survey maybe every year or 2 years, you run quarterly surveys. And we're certainly doing that with smaller landlords, less than 1,000, doing a small number of interviews that then compile together to give you your annual data, but also the quarterly data allows you to carry out that customer recovery, and it feels like you're in touch and it alerts you to any emerging issues. So think about those, weigh off the advantages and disadvantages. And ideally, because Acuity is a benchmarking organisation, a consistent approach over time is, you know, we've talked about the issues around survey methodology or on data, but also changing your survey method and your questions all interrupts trend series, and some people have got a lot of data on that. So try and think ahead and also look backwards as well. So that's often a challenge. But obviously by doing that, then you can benchmark the data at Acuity or SPBM, which is where you put it into context. And so lots to think about. Hopefully that was useful. And I'm going to stop there and just basically, any more questions? And obviously you've got my details there if you want to drop me a line. So Steve, how are we doing?
Yeah, thanks, Denise. Yeah, we've got some.
Shall I stop sharing? Do you want me to stop sharing? Or?
Yes, I think. Then we can have you on the big screen experience. Just picking up an issue around anonymity, easy for me to say. Kim Reagan's got a question, because at the moment they're doing postal surveys for their tenants, and they're all HFOP tenants, housing for older people. She's just saying, how do you, if you're doing the surveys by phone, how do you ensure anonymity?
For an internal landlord, that's very difficult because it won't be anonymous. That's where the external market research company comes into play. So I think internally it's more about being confidential with the data and respecting that you separate the data from personal details when you analyse it and share it within the organisation.
But I guess your point would always be, you can be confidential about data, but if you can actually identify the tenants and they've got a problem, and they've got an issue that needs to be put right, you can actually do something about it. And,
yeah, absolutely. And we know from those questions have always been in our surveys since I don't know, long time. So we know so about 85% of residents are very happy to be identified. And that also includes a lot of the smaller landlords where if you've only got 100 or 200 residents, you know everybody very well. And that's always been an issue around, we don't think historically some of those surveys have been run anonymously. But when we remove that, we found that people are happy to be identified and are happy to have further conversations. So if they're happy for the name to go back to the landlord, 95% are happy to have a conversation about anything they said in the survey. So I take from that residents do want to engage, and very few want to remain anonymous.
Okay, that's useful to know. Anne Phillips just wanted to make a comment. She just says that they always ask residents in a survey if they wish to get involved, and they've increased tenant involvement by over 500%. So perfect. That's actually worked. Because that's a conundrum we've all been trying to square for the last 30 years. Andrew Smith is saying, do those using online surveys ensure their sample is representative, particularly by age, because it influences the score so much? So if they're doing that, how do they square that with voluntary responding?
Yeah, so any data, at the end of any survey, unless you've got a very high response, but if you've done a sample, you have to check the data is representative of the population. So that's looking at, have we got an over response where it doesn't matter the survey methodology either. So if that's the case, then you've got to weight the data to make it representative. And that's the case online or telephone or postal.
Leslie's gone for the Marmite question. He said, no mention of NPS, that's Net Promoter Score. Has it fallen out of favour? No,
it's in most of our surveys. We love it. The amount of information you can get from just one question. And I always argue, I'm happy to be defeated, but my argument remains that's your loyalty, your brand. To get a 9 or 10 score on the 11-point scale is difficult. They are your champions, and as you move more digitally and the speed of communications, knowing that you've got those people out there, they're really important. And it also allows you to identify your detractors and those that are sitting at 0 out of 11 scores. You might want to have conversations with them, but you can look at them and see the profiles and understand really and ask them why they gave you that score. So I think it's a hugely valuable question. It's one of the 7 recommended questions that are in the perception questions. So the ones that fell out and some of the key ones like NPS are sitting in a recommended group. Yeah.
Right, okay. So probably like Marmite as well then. Francis Bolton is saying, do you know how HouseMark define vulnerability?
No.
He's saying, I'm thinking of the 28% vulnerability figure. How are landlords defining vulnerability in the COVID context?
I'm really interested in one to go back to. I'm sorry, I don't know. I will check that out. But yeah.
Okay. Well, that's something that we can post up afterwards.
Yeah.
With, details.
Yeah.
Of the, I think it's yeah, it is an interesting one. And finally, because I'm just conscious of where we are with the time, we're all going to turn into pumpkins within the next minute. David Alford says, do you have any tips for feeding back responses from a survey back to customers? We've tried various methods, but been rather surprised by how few tenants have then come back with further comment or engaged in this discussing the results.
I think it's always a challenge because you're always going to have a large cohort of residents that don't want to engage, hopefully, because they're happy with the services. But I think it's about going back through various channels, you know, and getting those results out there and making sure that you've got the right strategies in place that if people do want to engage and have a conversation about those ratings, that they can get in touch. But it's I don't think it's any different to, you know, in the old days when I worked in an organisation, sat amongst the resident advisor who ran all the resident association groups. You know, keeping that momentum going is difficult. So it's about how to do that, and maybe in an ideal world, you know, through digital communications, if you've got that kind of client group.
Right, thanks, Denise. That's taken us neatly to 11:30, so our hour is up. Thanks everybody for your questions and for attending today. We really do hope that you found it useful, and thanks very much, Denise, for giving us such a comprehensive overview and being able to answer every question bar one. But yes, so those the presentation and a recording of this will be put on our website. Yeah, thanks again everybody, and we'll be back in touch next time we do a webinar. Okay, bye-bye everyone.
Thank you, bye.